So I want you to picture something for a second.
Hmm.
Picture walking into like a perfectly manicured late 19th century Victorian garden.
Nice. Very peaceful.
Right. The roses are arranged by color, the hedges are completely symmetrical, the pathways are swept totally clean of any debris. It's safe, it's beautiful, and, it's entirely predictable.
You know exactly what you're getting.
Exactly. Every time you turn a corner, you know exactly what kind of statue or little fountain you're going to see. But then, out of nowhere, an earthquake hits.
The ground just completely drops out.
Yeah. The statues completely shatter, the hedges are ripped up by their roots, the neat brick pathways just crack wide open, and suddenly you're staring at this landscape of jagged rubble, mud, and just exposed raw earth.
So that safety is completely gone. That illusion of perfect divine order that the gardeners work so hard to maintain, it just vanishes in an instant.
And that shattered garden. That is exactly what happened to literature at the dawn of the 20th century. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at a literal literary earthquake.
It really was. We are going to explore how the trauma of the 20th century shattered language itself, and how two absolute titans of the era, W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, tried to put those pieces back together.
We've got a massive stack of historical and academic sources here. We're covering the evolution of British poetry from the late 19th century all the way through the 1960s. And we're going to use an intensive line-by-line lens on Eliot's monumental poem, The Wasteland, to really see this in action.
Our mission today is to distill this massive timeline into a clear, gripping narrative for you. Because the goal isn't just to tell you what happened in modern poetry. We want you to understand exactly why it happened.
Right.
Like, why did the language actually have to break? Why couldn't they just keep writing pretty rhymes?
So grab a cup of coffee, or if you're driving, just settle in, because you are our silent third partner in this intellectual journey today. Okay, let's unpack this. By the end of this deep dive, the most intimidating, baffling poems of the 20th century are going to make perfect sense to you.
To really understand the chaos of T.S. Eliot and the High Modernists, we first have to understand what they were rebelling against, right? Before we could appreciate the violence of the earthquake, we have to take a closer look at that Victorian garden you mentioned.
Okay, so what were the actual rules of that garden? Like, what did a quote-unquote good poem look like to a Victorian reader before everything broke apart?
Well, the Victorians loved what critics call conventionally bejeweled and smooth poetic diction. Think of poets like Alfred, Lord Tennyson.
Okay, so very proper.
Extremely proper. The language was highly elevated, very formal, heavily ornamented. It was all about high seriousness, pretty words, and honestly, a sort of moral priggishness.
Interesting. And what about the rhythm?
The rhythm was usually this very strict metronome-like beat, tadamum, tadi, padim, tadi,
Like your heartbeat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was soothing. It offered neat moral conclusions. Good was good, evil was evil, and God was in his heaven.
But as the world industrialized and urbanized, I imagine that smooth, soothing language just couldn't articulate the raw, disturbing reality of what people were actually seeing out their windows.
No, not at all.
You can't really describe a smog-choked factory using the same rhythm you use to describe a babbling brook, right?
Exactly. The language no longer fit the landscape. But this transition didn't happen overnight. There were crucial precursors in the late 19th century who started cracking the pavement of that garden.
Who are we talking about?
Well, for instance, you have Robert Browning. Browning introduced syntactical obscurity and natural voice articulation.
Wait, what does natural voice articulation actually look like in a poem?
It basically means he wrote in a way that sounded like real people talking, rather than a poet just declaiming from a mountaintop.
Oh, I see. Because real human speech is messy.
Right. We pause, we interrupt ourselves, we change thoughts mid-sentence. Browning forced poetry to accommodate the irregular, jagged rhythm of an actual human psyche.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then you have Thomas Hardy, who brought in this deep cosmic pessimism, heavy irony, and local dialect. Hardy didn't give you a neat moral bow at the end of his poem.
So no happy endings.
Far from it. He presented unresolved contradictions. He looked at the universe and essentially said, the universe does not care about you.
Wow. That's quite a departure from the reassuring Victorian worldview. But there's another figure here who acts as the real bridge to modernism, right? Gerard Manley Hopkins. Because from what I'm seeing in these sources, Hopkins seems incredibly strange for his time.
Oh, he was completely radical, though his work wasn't even published until well after he died. Hopkins was a Jesuit priest, actually, who revived the metaphysical mode of poetry.
Which means what exactly?
It means he would bring wildly disparate, almost clashing ideas together in a single image. But his most vital contribution, and this is a really foundational concept for you to grasp, is something he called sprung rhythm.
Sprung rhythm. Okay, how does that actually work mechanically, like on the page?
So in traditional Victorian poetry, you have a strict meter, let's say 10 syllables per line, alternating unstressed and stressed, a perfect metronome. Hopkins completely threw that metronome out the window.
Just got rid of it.
Completely. In sprung rhythm, he kept the number of stressed syllables fixed in a line, but he allowed the number of unstressed syllables to vary wildly.
Oh, I get it. So you might have one unstressed syllable between beats, or you might have four.
Exactly.
Think of it like this, for you listening. It's like a jazz drummer taking a rigid pop beat and intentionally breaking the rules.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the drummer adds syncopation, delaying a strike here, rushing a flurry of snare hits there, but always landing the main downbeat right when you least expect it, but exactly when it needs to happen. It makes the music feel infinitely more alive, raw, and unpredictable.
That is a perfect analogy. The rhythm leaps or springs forward, mimicking the chaotic energy of the natural world. And Hopkins also developed two highly specific philosophical concepts to explain what he was trying to achieve with this rhythm. He called them inscape and instress.
These sound like very dense academic terms. Can we translate these into everyday experience?
Absolutely. So inscape is the unique, distinct essence of a thing. It's absolute whatness.
Whatness.
Yeah. If you look at a specific oak tree, its inscape isn't just generic treeness. It is the exact, unrepeatable pattern of those specific branches, that specific bark, at that exact moment in time.
Okay, so capturing the hyper-specific reality rather than a generic ideal.
Exactly. And instress is the energy or force that holds that essence together and, crucially, delivers it into the observer's mind.
So it's the transfer of that energy.
Yes. So when you read a Hopkins poem, the jagged, intense rhythm, the sprung rhythm, is the instress acting upon you. He is trying to force you to feel the physical weight and energy of the object he's describing. He's trying to capture the exact, unrepeatable reality of an object, which actually became a core defining goal of the modernists who followed him.
And as we move toward the turn of the century, that desire to capture reality morphed into several different artistic movements, these late 19th century isms. I'm seeing aestheticism, symbolism, and imagism here. Can we break those down?
Briefly, yeah. Aestheticism was the art for art's sake crowd, figures like Oscar Wilde.
Right, very famous.
They completely rejected the Victorian idea that art had to have a moral or educational purpose. They valued pure craftsmanship and beauty over any kind of messaging.
Just make it beautiful.
Right. Then you have symbolism, originating mostly in France. The symbolists believed that pragmatic, everyday reality was just a surface layer. They used highly suggestive, dreamlike language to try and capture the mysterious spiritual life vibrating beneath that surface.
And then, right before World War I, we get imagism, which seems like a direct reaction against both the flowery Victorians and the dreamy symbolists.
Imagism is the big turning point. It was led by figures like Ezra Pound and T.E. Holm. Imagism wasn't just a style. It was a strict, almost militant manifesto.
Oh, really? What were the rules?
They have three main rules.
Okay.
First, direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. Don't talk around it, point directly at it.
Okay.
Second, use absolutely no extra words. Scrupulous economy. If an adjective doesn't do heavy lifting, you cut it.
Brutal editing.
Yeah. And third, compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of a metronome.
So, to physically demonstrate this for you, a Victorian poet might say, you know, the ethereal, delicate petals of the crimson rose drooped sadly in the mournful evening rain, weeping for lost loves.
Very flowery.
Right. It's incredibly flowery and tells you exactly how to feel. But an imagist poet would just say, red petals wet on the black bough.
That's it.
That's it. It's sharp. It's a photograph. It's hard precision.
Precisely. They wanted language to be as hard and clear as a diamond.
But stepping back for a second, why does all of this matter? Like, why this obsession with changing the rules of language itself? Why couldn't they just keep writing pretty rhymes?
Because the modern mind was experiencing a totally new, unprecedented reality, the megalopolis.
The massive city.
The rise of the massive industrial city. People were living in London or Paris, surrounded by millions of strangers, deafening machines, advertisements everywhere, different languages, rapid transit.
The world was getting loud.
Extremely loud. It was fragmented and heterogeneous. A neat Victorian rhyme simply could no longer hold the messy, overwhelming, industrialized reality of the 20th century. The brain was experiencing sensory overload.
Right. I mean, if you are sitting on a screeching subway train looking at an advertisement for soap while a stranger reads a newspaper about a war next to you, a neat ABAB rhyme scheme just feels like a lie.
Exactly. This psychological fragmentation required a new technique, which scholars call discontinuous composition.
It's discontinuous composition, which means
It means juxtaposing completely disconnected images and impressions right next to each other, without any smooth transitions or a narrator to hold your hand.
it's like the world shattered, so the poetry had to shatter to accurately reflect it.
That's exactly it.
Which is a perfect segue into how this theory of modernism was tested by the brutal physical reality of the 20th century. I want to look at this chronologically, from the 1910s to the 1960s, because reading through these sources, there is a fascinating pattern that emerges. It seems like every decade basically reacts violently against the decade that came just before it.
It is a literal pendulum swing in literary history. In the 1910s, right before the war, you have the Georgians, poets like Rupert Brooke and Edward Thomas. They were using a very colloquial, plain, nostalgic idiom, writing about the English countryside. It was a quieter reaction to Victorian grandeur.
But then the First World War hits, and the world doesn't just change, it is obliterated. You have these young men, the war poets Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, Wilfred Owen, who are sent into the trenches.
Yeah, it's horrific.
We have to really ground this in human experience. These guys are sitting in freezing mud, surrounded by rats and decaying bodies, dealing with mustard gas that literally drowns you from the inside out.
And how can you possibly use the polite, nostalgic language of the Georgians to describe mustard gas? You can't.
You just can't.
The war poets were forced to use shocking, gruesome, visceral realism. They wrote to expose the dehumanized insanity of the trenches. In doing so, they completely killed the patriotic humbug of the previous generation.
War wasn't glorious anymore.
No, it wasn't knights on horseback. It was organized, mechanized, unthinking slaughter. Owen famously called the idea that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country the old lie.
So the trauma of the trenches destroys polite poetry. But then we swing into the 1930s. The war is over, but the Great Depression hits, and fascism is rising in Europe. This decade is dominated by W.H. Auden and his circle, and they're reacting directly against the highly obscure, elite Franco-American modernism of people like T.S. Eliot, which had dominated the 1920s.
Yes, Auden and his contemporaries felt that Eliot's incredibly dense, mythic poetry was too detached from the immediate political crises of the day.
Two in the clouds.
Right. Auden was heavily influenced by Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. He focused on social reporting and political commitment. He wanted poetry to actually address the struggling working class and the looming threat of the Second World War.
So he brought it back down to earth.
He did. He returned to native English speech rhythms. He even used light verse, ballads, and parody to discuss serious doom. He made poetry public and political again.
But as soon as you hit the 1940s, the pendulum swings wildly back again. The world is plunged into WWII, London is being bombed in the Blitz, and out of this terror comes the era of neo-romanticism, led most famously by Dylan Thomas.
Thomas rebelled completely against the 1930s dry, journalistic political reporting. In a time of blackouts and bombings, political reporting just felt insufficient to capture the existential terror and the sheer mystery of survival.
So what did you do?
Thomas embraced his Welsh bardic tradition. He utilized Gothic effects, dreamlike terrors, and an absolute intoxication with words and myths. For Thomas, there was a pantheistic presence of God in nature, and his poetry was highly expressive, booming, and fiercely emotional.
Which, of course, the poets of the 1950s absolutely despised.
They hated it.
In the 50s, a group emerges literally called The Movement, featuring writers like Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis. They looked at the booming emotional excess of Dylan Thomas and basically said, no thanks, that's embarrassing.
They really wanted a return to sanity. The 50s poets desired elegant perspicuity, which just means supreme clarity. They returned to traditional meters and a sort of dry, stolid academicism.
Very restrained.
Exactly. Larkin, in particular, focused on provincial, suburban, humdrum life. He famously rejected what he called the myth kitty of classical illusions.
The myth kitty, I love that term.
Yeah, he didn't want any more poems about Greek gods or foreign cities or deep, dark passions. He wanted to write about taking a train ride or looking at an empty church or the quiet disappointments of ordinary, orderly common sense.
And right on cue, that polite, wry conservatism of the 50s inevitably led to a massive, violent explosion in the 1960s and beyond. It's like they couldn't stand the politeness anymore.
Exactly. Ted Hughes came along and completely shattered the suburban quiet by bringing back atavistic primordial savagery and animal instincts to poetry. He wrote about hawks and crows with this brutal, muscular language.
Very visceral.
And then you have Sylvia Plath, heavily influenced by American models, who introduced confessional poetry to Britain. She stripped away all the polite distance and contextualized intense psychological terror and the equivocating anxieties of gender in a patriarchal society.
And then Seamus Heaney in Ireland, who used the physical Irish bogs, these deep, dark, preserving layers of peat, as a metaphor for the dark, subterranean deposits of history and the cyclical, ritualistic violence of humanity.
It's like a constant evolution.
So looking at this whole timeline, this constant pendulum swinging, complexity breeds a desire for simplicity, extreme emotion breeds a return to cold logic. But I have to ask you, if poetry is constantly just rebelling against whatever the previous generation did exactly 10 years before, is it ever actually moving forward, or is this just a series of generational temper tantrums like, my dad liked rhymes, so I hate rhymes?
That's a very fair question, and I mean, it does look like a temper tantrum on the surface. But I would argue it's moving forward, but in a dialectical way.
Dialectical.
Meaning a thesis is presented, an antithesis reacts to it, and the result is a synthesis that is entirely new. Each generation absorbs the specific trauma, the technological shifts, and the political realities of their exact moment. They reject the style of their predecessors because that older style simply cannot physically contain their new reality.
So the language has to evolve just to keep up with the world.
Exactly. But here is the key. Even as they reject the style, they build upon the underlying expansion of what poetry is allowed to discuss. The temper tantrum actually permanently widens the boundaries of the art form.
Oh, I see.
Like the 1960s confessional poets could write with such raw psychological honesty, precisely because the modernists of the 1920s had already smashed the requirement for polite Victorian morality.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So, having mapped this massive chaotic era, I want to zoom in tightly on one man. A man whose own lifetime actually spanned and embodied this entire transition. A poet who started out in 19th century dreamy romanticism and somehow ended his career as a master of 20th century hard modernism, W.B. Yeats.
Yeats is endlessly fascinating because he just contains multitudes. To understand Yeats, you have to understand his deeply divided background. He had a dual Anglo-Irish identity, which meant he was caught between two completely different worlds.
Right.
On one hand, he was born into the Protestant ascendancy. This was the elite, landowning class in Ireland, with strong ties to British rule and London intellect.
But on the other hand, he spent a huge portion of his youth in Sligo, on the rugged west coast of Ireland. And there, he was surrounded by the Catholic peasantry, by Gaelic folklore, by ghost stories, and a deep ancient superstition.
Okay.
He was constantly torn between the rational imperial world of London and the mystical ancient world of rural Ireland.
And his early poetry, what critics call his phase one, or the Celtic Twilight phase, leans entirely into that rural mysticism. It is incredibly wistful, dreamy, and highly musical.
Lots of fairies and myths.
Heavily influenced by the pre-Raphaelites, yeah. He wrote extensively about Celtic myths, fairies, and wandering heroes. But this wasn't just him telling children's stories. It was a conscious attempt to escape the joyless industrial squalor of the modern urban world.
He literally looked at factories and clerks in London and said, I'd rather be in a fairy mound. But Yeats wasn't just daydreaming. He took this rejection of the modern world to an extreme level. He fundamentally rejected Christian dogma, but he also completely rejected the scientific rationalism of the Victorian age. To replace them, he turned to something that sounds completely wild to a modern ear. Magic. Yes, actual serious magic. He joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a secret society devoted to the study of the occult, and Madame Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. Now, when we say magic, I want to be clear for you listening. We aren't talking about pulling rabbits out of hats or stage illusions. We are talking about a deeply held belief in spiritual forces. He actually developed an incredibly complex, overarching philosophical system, which he later published in a dense book called A Vision.
It is incredibly dense.
And get this, he developed this system through his wife's automatic writing during seances. They would sit in a trance, and her hand would frantically write out these spiritual dictations for hours. It's wild. But from those seances, he developed 3 core metaphors that structured his entire worldview.
Let's break those down, because they are essential to unlocking his poetry. The first is the mask. This is Yeats's doctrine of the self versus the anti-self.
Okay, the anti-self.
Yeats believed that to achieve what he called unity of being, a state of perfect psychological and spiritual wholeness, We cannot just passively accept the personality we were born with.
Especially because he viewed his natural self as rather timid, bookish, and awkward.
Exactly. So he believed we must consciously, even theatrically, create a second self, a mask that is our exact opposite. And we must strive every day to become that opposite. If you are naturally timid, your mask must be a bold, heroic man of action.
I always relate the concept of the mask to how people today curate online personas. Think about it. You create an avatar or a social media profile that represents the idealized, highly polished opposite version of your daily mundane self. You project confidence, beauty, and success. And in performing that role online every single day, it actually starts to shape who you are in real life. The mask becomes the face.
That's a brilliant modern equivalent. For Yeats, putting on the mask was how he gained the strength to write poetry that his normal, timid self never could have written.
Oh,
And the second core metaphor in his system is the moon.
right. He divided human personality and the entirety of human history into 28 phases, corresponding directly to the lunar cycle.
Yes. Phase 1 is the completely dark moon, and phase 15 is the perfectly full moon. In Yeats's system, these two phases represent unachievable states of pure perfection. Phase 1 is perfect physical objectivity, and phase 15 is perfect subjective imagination.
So where do we sit in?
Every human being who has ever lived exists somewhere in the messy, imperfect phases in between, struggling toward one of those poles.
And the third metaphor is the most famous and probably the hardest to visualize, the gyres.
Think of a gyre as a swirling cone or a spiral. Imagine two interpenetrating whirling cones of history. As one cone expands and spins outward, the other cone is inside it, contracting. Yeats believed human history moved in 2,000-year cycles driven by these gyres.
So the era of ancient Greece was one gyre. Then the era of Christ was a new gyre, starting its expansion while the Greek one collapsed. And now, in the 20th century, 2,000 years later, the Christian rational gyre is reaching its maximum expansion and collapsing, while a new, terrifying, chaotic primal gyre is starting to expand and take its place.
Exactly. It's a philosophy of inevitable, cyclical destruction and rebirth.
But looking at all of this, the seances, the moons, the spinning cones, I have to push back a bit. Is Yeats's elaborate system a genuine, literal belief in magic? Or is this just a desperate coping mechanism? Like, is he just a guy terrified of a civilization that is falling apart, trying to invent an imaginary structure to hold his own sanity together?
That is the eternal debate about Yeats. I would argue that for Yeats it was both. But primarily, it was the ultimate rebellion against what he called the merchant and clerk mentality of modern capitalism.
He hated that mindset.
He despised a world reduced to profit margins and scientific measurements. For him, magic was a serious, rigorous discipline used to access the anima mundi, the collective unconscious of the human race. It provided the mythic structure his mind desperately needed to make sense of the horrors of history.
And horrors were definitely coming. Because the dream-burdened fairy tale Yeats of the Celtic Twilight couldn't survive the brutal realities of the 20th century. This brings us to how his poetry hardened into his famous later phase. He strips away the fairies and replaces them with a cold, hard, unyielding aesthetic. And looking at the sources, there were three main catalysts for this profound change.
The first was his practical work running the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. Dealing with actors, budgets, and riots over controversial plays forced him out of the dream world and into the abrasive reality of public life.
Makes sense.
The second was the sheer unprecedented violence of World War I, quickly followed by the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. Blood was literally running in the streets.
And the third catalyst, which arguably affected him the most personally, was his agonizing, decades-long, unrequited love for a woman named Maud Gonne.
Maud Gonne was a famously beautiful, fiery, radical Irish nationalist. She was fully committed to using physical force to drive the British out of Ireland. Yeats was deeply, obsessively in love with her.
But she didn't feel the same way.
He proposed to her multiple times over the years, and she rejected him every single time. She felt his poetry was a distraction from the real, violent work of the revolution.
Maud Gonne is the absolute center of Yeats's emotional world. His transition away from dreamy language really begins to show in a poem called Adam's Curse. It's entirely different from his early work. It uses a straightforward conversational tone. The poem discusses the exhausting, agonizing labor required to make art appear effortless. He compares the labor of the poet to the labor women undergo to maintain physical beauty.
And crucially, in the poem, Maud Gonne is present, but she sits completely silent. Yeats laments the decline of their relationship and the harsh, inevitable reality of aging. The romantic dream is fading into physical exhaustion.
He takes this tension between love and violence much further in a later poem, No Second Troy. By this point, Maud Gonne's revolutionary politics were causing real destruction in Ireland. She was inciting riots and protests.
In No Second Troy, Yeats elevates her from a historical figure into a myth. He compares her directly to Helen of Troy, the woman whose beauty caused an entire civilization to burn. He asks a rhetorical question. Why should he blame her for filling his days with misery or for teaching ignorant, common men violent ways?
He describes her beauty with this incredibly sharp, modernist image. He calls it a tightened bow. It's a brilliant metaphor. A tightened bow is beautiful, it's elegant, it has perfect tension, but its sole purpose is lethal, destructive energy. It exists to fire an arrow and kill.
And in the end, he essentially forgives her destructive political zeal. He concludes that she is a tragic, heroic figure born into the wrong era. She has this pure, fiery, aristocratic nature that simply doesn't fit in a petty, modern, merchant-driven world. If she had lived in ancient Greece, there would have been a second Troy for her to burn. But because she lives in modern Dublin, she just causes localized chaos.
This collision of myth and harsh political reality climaxes in what is arguably his masterpiece of this period, Easter 1916. Now, a very quick note for you listening. When we discuss the Irish uprising against British rule or Maud Gonne's nationalism, we are examining these strictly as historical and literary catalysts for Yeats's art. The sources provide this context to explain the poetry. We remain entirely impartial on the historical conflicts themselves. What matters here is how the sheer violence of the event completely fractured Yeats's worldview.
Absolutely. So context. In Easter of 1916, Irish Republicans launched an armed insurrection in Dublin against British rule. It was a bloody failure, and the British executed the leaders of the rebellion by firing squad.
And in Easter 1916, Yeats is deeply, painfully torn. Before the rebellion, he had openly despised many of these leaders. He saw them as petty, middle-class shopkeepers and clerks. He thought they were all talk.
But then they rebelled, they fought, and they sacrificed their lives. And that ultimate sacrifice completely transformed them in Yeats's eyes. They ceased to be ordinary clerks and were elevated into tragic, mythic heroes. This is where the most famous, haunting quote of the era comes from. A terrible beauty is born.
A terrible beauty. It's the perfect oxymoron. It is beautiful because of the absolute purity of their heroic sacrifice, but it is terrible because of the death, the destruction, and the loss of life. But he doesn't just praise them. He uses a brilliant, deeply complex image in the middle of the poem, a stone in the midst of a stream.
Yes, this is where Yeats's genius really shines. The stream represents the living, changing, spontaneous flow of natural life. The clouds changing, the horses splashing, the birds flying, everything is in flux. The stone, however, represents the unchanging, fanatical, revolutionary purpose of the rebels.
Their dedication to one purpose alone makes a stone of the heart. It sits at the bottom of the stream and troubles the living water. It's a profound, chilling meditation on how political fanaticism, even for a cause you might respect, freezes human empathy. It removes you from the messy flow of life and turns you into something hard, dead, and immovable.
As Yeats aged, this tension between the messy, physical world of living streams and the eternal, unchanging world of the stone became his absolute obsession. He felt his own physical body breaking down while his intellect and spirit remained sharp.
Which leads us directly to one of his most famous later poems, Sailing to Byzantium. It's the ultimate dialectic of flesh versus spirit. He opens the poem with a brutal assessment of aging. That is no country for old men. He writes that an old man is nothing but a tattered coat upon a stick. His physical body is humiliatingly failing him.
So he decides to abandon the natural world. He calls it the world of dying generations. It is a world of salmon falls, mackerel-crowded seas, birds in the trees. It's a world obsessed with sensual music, the cycle of birth, copulation, and death. It's biology, and biology always ends in decay.
So if you can't survive in the biological world, where do you go? He sets sail on a purely spiritual, imaginative journey to the holy city of Byzantium. For Yeats, the ancient city of Byzantium represents the perfect, timeless world of pure art, intellect, and spiritual permanence. It is a city of gold and mosaics, not mud and blood.
He literally begs the sages depicted in the gold mosaics of Byzantium to step out of the wall, spin in a gyre, and purge him in holy fire. He wants them to burn away his physical heart, which he says is sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. He wants to be gathered into the artifice of eternity.
The ending of this poem is staggering. He says that once he is out of nature, he will never again take his bodily form from any natural thing. Instead, he wants to be turned into a mechanical golden bird, crafted by Grecian goldsmiths, placed on a golden bough to sing to the emperor. He wants to become an immortal, unchanging piece of art, singing of what is past, or passing, or to come. He wants to escape the humiliation of biology by becoming an object.
It's a desperate plea for permanence. And yet, Yeats was painfully aware that even art, even civilization itself, is incredibly fragile. As World War II looms on the horizon, threatening to destroy everything humanity has built, he writes Lapis Lazuli.
This poem is his final, defiant stance against the apocalypse. People around him are panicking. He notes that hysterical women are saying that poets and painters are completely useless when bomber planes are about to drop bombs on the city. Like, why write poetry when the world is ending?
But Yeats introduces this profound philosophical concept of tragic joy. He points to Shakespeare's greatest tragedies. He says that if you look at Hamlet or King Lear, they don't break down weeping at the end of their plays. When the stage is covered in bodies, they face the apocalypse with gaiety, with a defiant, almost transcendent joy. They understand that tragedy is the human condition, and they accept it with aristocratic grace.
To ground this, he looks at a physical object on his desk, a piece of carved Chinese gemstone, lapis lazuli. It features a carving of a wise ascetic, a pupil, and a long-legged crane flying above them. As he stares at it, he realizes that civilizations will always rise and fall. That is the nature of the gyres. Towers will always collapse. But the spirit of art, the innate human wisdom to rebuild, survives every collapse. He imagines the carved figure staring out from the stone at the entire tragic, bloody scene of human history. And as they look at the destruction, their eyes, their ancient glittering eyes, are gay.
It is a masterful synthesis of the personal and the historical. Yeats built a massive magical fortress of myth, the gyres, the masks, the golden birds, to survive the collapse of the world around him. He tried to rise above it.
But while Yeats was trying to order the modern chaos by building his personal mythology of towers, his younger contemporary, T.S. Eliot, took the exact opposite approach. If Yeats tried to fly above the rubble, Eliot dove headfirst into the shattered mud of Europe.
And this brings us to the most famous and perhaps the most difficult poem of the 20th century, The Wasteland, published in 1922. We really have to set the context for this, because it wasn't written by a man in a position of strength. Eliot wrote this while recovering from a severe mental breakdown at a sanatorium in Switzerland. His marriage was a disaster, his finances were strained, and the trauma of World War I hung over everything.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the poem you know today, the one printed in all the textbooks, is not the poem Eliot originally wrote. It was heavily, aggressively, almost violently edited by his friend, the poet Ezra Pound.
Pound was ruthless. He acted as a literary surgeon. Eliot handed him this sprawling, chaotic manuscript, and Pound just started slashing. He cut out huge swaths of the poem, including a very long traditional shipwreck scene modeled on Dante, and several rhyming parodies of the 18th century poet Alexander Pope.
Pound looked at those traditional parts and basically said, "This isn't modern, cut it."
Exactly. By cutting out all the connected tissue and the traditional narrative bridges, Pound tightened the poem. He made it more disjointed, more abrupt, and ultimately far more shocking and modern. Eliot was so incredibly grateful for the surgery that he dedicated the final poem to Pound, calling him Il miglior fabbro, the better craftsman.
To read The Wasteland for the first time is a deeply disorienting experience. For you listening, imagine it like this. You are sitting in a dark room, channel surfing on a broken television set. You catch a 5-second flash of a horror movie, then it abruptly cuts to a posh soap opera, then a gritty news broadcast, then a foreign language commercial, then pure static, then a fortune teller. And there are no commercials or transitions to warn you the channel is changing. But somehow, miraculously, all these completely disconnected channels are telling one unified, horrifying story about the spiritual death of Europe.
That is the perfect way to visualize the technique of discontinuous composition we discussed earlier, pushed to its absolute limit. But to give this broken television set some kind of underlying structure, Eliot used a mythic framework. He based the deep architecture of the poem on the legend of the Fisher King and the quest for the Holy Grail.
What is the Fisher King myth exactly, for those who might not know?
In ancient Arthurian legend, the Fisher King is a ruler who has suffered a terrible maiming, usually a wound to the groin, a sickness that renders him completely impotent. Because the king is physically tied to his land, his sickness causes the land itself to die. It becomes a barren wasteland where no crops will grow, no water flows, and no animals reproduce. The only way to heal the land is for a pure knight to undertake the quest for the Holy Grail, survive the Chapel Perilous, and ask the right spiritual questions.
Eliot transposes that ancient magical myth directly onto post-WWI Europe. The physical, sexual sterility of the Fisher King becomes the spiritual, moral, and emotional sterility of the modern world. Let's break down how he actually does this, starting with part 1, the burial of the dead.
Eliot opens the poem by completely violently inverting the father of English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer famously starts the Canterbury Tales by praising April. He writes about the sweet showers of spring piercing the drought of March, waking everyone up to go on a joyful pilgrimage. Eliot takes that exact image and twists it. He writes, April is the cruelest month.
Why on earth would spring be cruel?
Because in a wasteland, the inhabitants are spiritually dead, and they want to stay that way. Winter brings a numb forgetfulness. It covers the dead earth in a protective, suffocating snow. You don't have to feel anything, but spring forces them to remember. It breeds lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire. It feels as a painful, agonizing rebirth upon people who are emotionally exhausted and just want to remain asleep in the dark. Waking up is painful.
We then immediately get thrown into these fragmented voices, these different TV channels. We meet Marie, a former aristocrat, remembering riding on a sled in the mountains as a child. She symbolizes the decadent, rootless, terrified European aristocracy whose world was destroyed by the war. Then the channel shifts, and we get the Hyacinth Girl.
The Hyacinth Girl represents a moment of pure romantic potential. The narrator is handed a moment of profound beauty, a girl returning from the garden with her arms full of wet flowers. But the narrator is completely paralyzed. He says, I could not speak and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence. It is a catastrophic failure to connect. Love is offered, and the modern soul is too empty to receive it.
And crucially, we then meet Madame Sosostris, a degraded modern clairvoyant. She claims to be the wisest woman in Europe, but she has a bad cold. She reads tarot cards for her clients. The ancient magic of prophecy, which Yeats took so seriously, has been reduced to a cheap commercial parlor trick in Eliot's world.
She draws the cards. She finds the drowned Phoenician sailor. She finds Belladonna, the lady of situations. She finds the man with 3 staves and the one-eyed merchant. But she explicitly tells the narrator what she cannot find. She says, I do not find the hanged man.
And the hanged man in the tarot deck symbolizes the sacrificed and resurrected God. It symbolizes Christ, or spiritual redemption. The fact that she explicitly cannot find him means that redemption is literally missing from the modern deck of cards. You cannot win a game of salvation with this deck.
The section ends with an incredibly famous hallucinatory vision. The narrator describes the unreal city, which is London or Paris, wrapped in a thick, brown, polluted winter fog. The commuters are flowing over London Bridge on their way to their financial jobs in the city. But Eliot describes them using direct quotes from Dante's Inferno. He says, I had not thought death had undone so many. The modern workers are literally the damned souls in hell, sighing, their eyes fixed before their feet, completely dead inside.
And then the narrator stops a man he recognizes named Stetson and asks him an utterly bizarre question. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? It's a grotesque, horrifying mockery of ancient fertility rituals. In the ancient world, you bury the seed god to bring forth new life in the spring. In the modern world, we just bury corpses to hide the decay. There is no rebirth.
From this massive societal death, we move to part 2, a game of chess. The title itself implies that human relationships, particularly romantic ones, have lost all their organic warmth. Love has become nothing but strategic, calculating, defensive moves to overcome an opponent. Eliot masterfully contrasts the sterility of high society with the sterility of the lower class to show that this disease affects everyone.
Scene 1 places us in a claustrophobic, incredibly opulent, perfume-choked room. It's described like Cleopatra's ancient boudoir. A rich, highly neurotic woman is frantically brushing her hair, demanding that her silent lover speak to her. Speak to me! Why do you never speak? Speak! She is desperate.
She asks him what he is thinking, and we hear his internal monologue. He silently thinks, I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. It is chilling. Even surrounded by immense wealth and luxury, their relationship is a complete emotional and spiritual void.
And the details of the room are deeply symbolic. Above their mantel is a beautiful tapestry depicting the ancient, brutal myth of the rape of Philomela, who was attacked by a king, had her tongue cut out so she couldn't speak, and was finally transformed by the gods into a nightingale.
Her pure, tragic song is represented in the text by the words jugged, jug, which is critical because to Elizabethan ears, Jug Jug was a dirty, vulgar joke about sex.
So even ancient, profound tragedy has been degraded into a cheap, dirty joke by the modern world. Then, abruptly, without warning, the channel changes to scene two. We are no longer in a gilded mansion. We are in a gritty, noisy London pub at closing time. The bartender keeps interrupting the conversation by shouting, "Hurry up, please, it's time."
We overhear a working-class woman named Lil and her friend talking. Lil's husband, Albert, is coming back from the war, and she looks terrible. She had to buy a set of false teeth, and she completely ruined her health, taking pills to induce a back-alley abortion.
She says she's had 5 children already, and the pills for the abortion made her look ancient. Her friend coldly asks what you get married for if you don't want children. Again, it's a total subversion of the fertility myth. Whether you are in a gilded mansion surrounded by perfumes or a dirty pub drinking cheap gin, sex and love are entirely divorced from creation and joy. They lead only to neurosis, physical ruin, and a desperate emptiness.
Having established that the land itself is dead, Eliot zeroes in even further on the specific pollution of love and sex in the modern world. This brings us to part 3, the fire sermon.
The title, The Fire Sermon, is a direct reference to a famous sermon by the Buddha. The Buddha preached about the absolute necessity of extinguishing the fires of human lust, passion, and materialism if you ever want to achieve enlightenment. Eliot begins this section by showing us the River Thames in London.
But this isn't the beautiful, sparkling river of Elizabethan poetry where nymphs play and lovers meet. The magic nymphs are gone. Instead, the riverbanks are infested with slimy rats, and the water is choked with the debris left behind by the loitering heirs of city directors. There are empty silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends. It is a landscape of casual, discarded, meaningless consumption.
And it is here, in this polluted landscape, that we finally meet the most important figure in the entire poem, a figure you absolutely must grasp if you want to understand the wasteland, Tiresias.
Tiresias is a blind prophet from Greek mythology. He is completely unique because he lived as both a man and a woman, and he has been granted the gift of prophecy by the gods. He has lived for centuries. Eliot explicitly stated in his own footnotes that Tiresias is the central consciousness of the poem.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning every other character we've seen so far literally melts into him. The rich woman with the hairbrush, the poor woman in the pub, the silent lover. All the women melt into one woman, all the men into one man, and both sexes meet and reside within Tiresias. Because Tiresias exists entirely outside of time and gender, he is the only one who can connect the ancient grand myths of Cleopatra and Philomela to the grubby, modern squalor of a London apartment.
He is the ultimate weary observer of human history. And what does the supreme prophet, who has seen everything humanity has to offer for thousands of years, see in the modern world? He watches a deeply depressing, mechanical sexual encounter.
Yes. Tiresias watches the scene between a tired, bored typist coming home from work and an arrogant, carbuncular house agent's clerk. Carbuncular meaning covered in boils or pimples. It is the least romantic, least passionate scene imaginable.
The clerk arrives at her dingy apartment. They eat dinner out of tins. He essentially assaults her out of sheer boredom. And she offers no resistance, not because she desires him, but because she is just entirely indifferent. She is too tired to fight him off. After he leaves, feeling victorious, she feels absolutely nothing. She just smooths her hair with an automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. But I have to push back on Eliot here. When you read this, it feels almost hateful. Is Eliot just being a massive elitist prude who hates modern relationships? Is he just disgusted by working-class people having sex? Or is he saying something deeper about the human condition?
That is a very common reaction, but it's definitely the latter. Eliot isn't recoiling from the physical act of sex itself. He's recoiling in horror from the utter meaninglessness of it in the modern age. When the spiritual dimension of humanity is erased, we are reduced to mere biological machines. Eating out of tins, sleeping, reproducing, it all becomes an automatic, thoughtless reflex, exactly like putting a needle on a gramophone record. There is no love, no connection, no fertility.
That's why the section ends with such a powerful global synthesis. Eliot brings together the two great ascetic traditions of the world. He quotes St. Augustine from the Christian West, who famously wrote about coming to Carthage, surrounded by a cauldron of unholy loves, and he combines that with the Buddha from the East.
Both the Christian saint and the Eastern mystic arrive at the exact same inescapable conclusion. To Carthage then I came, burning, burning, burning. The fires of lust, greed, and materialism are destroying the world, and they must be burned away through severe asceticism and spiritual discipline.
Which takes us, almost like a punishment, to part 4. Death by water. This is the shortest section of the entire poem, just a handful of lines, and it is bone-chilling. It focuses entirely on Phlebas the Phoenician, the drowned sailor that Madame Sosostris warned us about all the way back in part 1. He is drowned in the ocean.
As he lies deep under the sea, the ocean currents gently pick his bones apart in whispers. The poem says he forgets the cry of the gulls, the deep sea swell, and all the profit and loss of his merchant life. In the vast, uncaring ocean, the worldly, anxious concerns of capitalism and commerce are completely obliterated.
The poem then does something shocking. It turns away from the corpse and explicitly addresses you, the reader, directly. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you.
It is a classic memento mori, a stark reminder of your own inevitable mortality. And critically, unlike the ancient fertility myths where the drowned god is miraculously resurrected in the spring to heal the land, there is no resurrection for Phlebas. It's just the absolute cold, unfeeling finality of physical death. The water doesn't cleanse him, it just erases him.
We have survived the scorching fire of lust and the suffocating drowning of the physical body. Now we reach the climax of the poem, part V, What the Thunder Said. The scenery shifts completely. We are no longer in polluted London or under the ocean. We are abruptly transported to a mountainous, arid, blindingly hot rock desert. We are on a desperate, agonizing search for water and salvation in a ruined world.
To build this climax, Eliot brilliantly merges 3 different historical and mythical journeys into one single, terrifying trek. First, he uses the biblical journey to Emmaus. In the Gospel of Luke, after Christ's crucifixion, 2 disciples are walking on the road, deeply depressed. They are joined by a hooded third figure walking beside them, whom they don't initially recognize as the resurrected Christ.
Who is the third who walks always beside you?
Exactly. Second, he overlays this with a mythical approach to the Chapel Perilous. In the Arthurian legends, this is the final, terrifying, supernatural test the knight must face before he can find the Holy Grail and heal the Fisher King. And third, grounding in reality, he references the very real contemporary decay of Eastern Europe, specifically the chaos of the Russian Revolution, which Eliot envisioned as hooded hordes swarming over endless flat plains.
He paints a terrifying panoramic picture of falling towers across the globe. He lists the great foundational centers of human civilization: Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London. And he pronounces a single, devastating judgment on all of them. Unreal. The entire history of human civilization, from the ancient world to the modern metropolis, is collapsing simultaneously.
And the sheer physical agony of this desert trek is captured in what critics call the mesmerizing, hallucinatory, water-dripping song. The narrator is practically delirious from thirst, begging for the sound of water among the dry rocks.
The rhythm here is incredible. It perfectly mimics a desperate, parched mind snapping. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock, one cannot stop or think. He says, if there were only the sound of water, a spring, a pool, even a hermit thrush singing in the pine trees. But there is no water.
But then finally they reach the Chapel Perilous. It is an empty, decayed, ruined chapel, surrounded by tumbled graves. There's no magic cup waiting for them. But suddenly, a cock crows on the roof tree. Cocorico.
The rooster crowing. In European folklore, the crowing of the cock signals the dawn and banishes wandering ghosts and evil spirits back to the underworld.
Yes, and immediately following that piercing cry, a flash of lightning hits and a damp gust of wind arrives, bringing the long-awaited rain. The drought is finally breaking.
And with the rain comes the thunder. But in Eliot's mythic world, the thunder doesn't just rumble, it actually speaks. And to understand what it says, Eliot turns away from the destroyed Western world entirely. He turns to the East. He looks to the ancient Hindu texts, the Upanishads, specifically the fable of the message of Prajapati, the creator god speaking to men, demons, and gods. The thunder delivers 3 supreme commands in Sanskrit. DA.
The first command is data, which translates to give or charity. The poem asks, what have we given of ourselves? And the narrator admits that the only thing he has ever truly given is the awful daring of a moment's surrender, a moment of passion that can never be retracted, but not true, selfless charity.
DA. The second command is diadvam, which translates to sympathize or compassion. The thunder reminds us that we are all locked in our own individual prisons of ego and selfishness. We hear the key turn in the door once and we are trapped inside ourselves, unable to truly connect with anyone else. Compassion is the only thing that provides the key to escape that solitary confinement.
DA. The third command is damyata, which translates to control or self-restraint. The poem uses a beautiful sailing metaphor. It says that if we submit to divine spiritual control, our hearts would beat obediently and joyfully, like a well-steered ship responding perfectly to the hands of an expert sailor.
Give, sympathize, control, data, that. The poem then shifts one last time, pulling back to a wide shot of the Fisher King. He is sitting on the shore, fishing, with the arid, destroyed plain behind him. He asks himself if he should at least try to set his own lands in order. The Bridge of London is falling down behind him, and he says this incredibly famous line, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins."
He is gathering up all the broken quotes, the shattered myths, the fragments of art, foreign languages, and poetry we've seen violently colliding throughout the entire poem. He is using these tiny scraps of culture to brace his collapsing world, trying to build a shelter out of the debris.
And the poem concludes with a formal ending drawn directly from the Upanishads, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Eliot translates this in his notes as, "the peace that passeth understanding." But I have to ask you, as a reader, hitting that final line, after over 400 lines of utter devastation, abortion pills, drowned sailors, and destroyed cities, is it really peace? Do we actually feel peace at the end of this?
That is the ultimate enduring question for anyone who reads this poem. Does Shanti represent true spiritual enlightenment and hope? Has the rain actually come to heal the wasteland, or was it just a brief shower? Or, as many prominent critics suggest, is that chanting just the sound of total catatonic exhaustion? Is it a hollow, consolatory formula muttered by a mind that is completely collapsed as the world ends around it? The absolute brilliance of The Wasteland is that it refuses to give you a neat Victorian answer. It forces you to sit in the terrifying ambiguity of the modern world.
And that profound ambiguity brings all the scattered, shattered pieces of our deep dive together. We have mapped a massive tectonic shift in human thought. We started in the safe, rhyming Victorian garden. We watched Hopkins break the rhythm to capture the violent energy of nature. We saw the polite poetry of the Georgians slaughtered in the muddy, gas-filled trenches of the First World War. We watched the pendulum swing wildly between Auden's political logic and Dylan Thomas's screaming emotion. And we arrived in the fragmented, overloaded minds of the high modernists. You now possess a deep, structural mastery over this incredibly dense material.
You've seen exactly how the language of literature was forced to evolve. The pendulum swings between emotion and intellect, between the traditional and the experimental, driven always by the trauma and the changing technology of the times. The rules of poetry were permanently rewritten because the rules of reality had permanently changed.
To leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over on your own, both W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot stared down the exact same shattered post-WWI reality. They both saw the garden utterly destroyed. Yeats's response was to look at the rubble and decide to build an elaborate, rigid, magical tower of personal mythology. He used his gyres, his masks, his golden birds of Byzantium to rise above the chaos. He sought permanence in art and myth.
Eliot's response was the exact opposite. He refused to escape. He got down in the mud, gathered up the broken, terrifying, disjointed fragments of global history, and forced us to look directly at the ruins of our own making.
As you navigate today's world, a world defined by relentless information overload, deep political division, scrolling through fragmented social media feeds, and cultural anxiety, which approach do you think is more necessary right now? Do we need to build a new mythology, a new tower to save our sanity and rise above the noise? Or do we need to confront the wasteland head-on, shoring up whatever fragments of truth we can find in the dirt? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into modern British poetry. We highly encourage you to take this new perspective, actually open up these incredibly powerful poems, and see the fragments for yourself. Until next time.